Thank you. Thank you for joining tonight. We are here to welcome Nader Tehrani, old friend, great colleague, not old in... We just talked about this, so I'm like, slam. Long-time friend. I have to say, the first time I met Nader was actually, weirdly enough, not so much in person. It was when I was starting to teach in Harvard. I got the first day to the administration desk to register myself and could not focus on this person behind the desk because the desk itself was absolutely phenomenal. And so I was staring at the desk, and I was like, remember saying to this woman, like, who made the desk? Like, forget me teaching here. And that was Nader and his office, so it was quite funny. So I met him before, I met his work before meeting himself. Nader, of course, is the founding principal of the Boston-based firm NADAAA, a practice dedicated to the advancement of design innovation, interdisciplinary collaboration, and an intensive dialogue with the construction industry. He is also the dean of the Irwin Chanin School of Architecture at the Cooper Union, and we're so glad to have him here tonight. He received his B.Arch from the Rhode Island School of Design and continued his studies at the Architecture Association in London, where he attended the postgraduate program in history and theory. Upon his return in the United States, he received his MAUD from Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he later also was teaching. That's when I met him also. For his contribution to architecture as an art, he received the 2020 Arnold Brunner Memorial Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, to which he also was elected as a member in 2021, the highest form of recognition of artistic merit in the United States. Congratulations. I'm actually not sure. Should I mention all your awards? It is a long list. I actually just said to him, well, as we were writing this introduction, I looked at the list, and it got longer and longer as we were writing longer, and I said at some point, if I mention them all, I don't think you have time to lecture. Maybe, so we'll keep it a little bit shorter. Anyway, I'll mention a few. He also got awarded the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award in Architecture, the United States Artist Fellowship in Architecture and Design, and the American Academy of Arts and Letters Award in Architecture. Throughout his career, he has received 18 PA awards, as well as numerous national and international design awards. He served as the Frank Gehry International Visiting Chair in Architectural Design at the University of Toronto and the inaugural Paul Helm Fellow at the California State Polytech University in Pomona. For about 7 years in a row, NADAAA has ranked on the top 11 design firms in Architecture Magazine's top 50 firms in the US, ranking at number 1 three years in a row. And most recently, he received the 2022 AIA New York Honor Award for the MIT Site 4 and an AIA New York Merit Award for Adams Street Branch Library in Boston. Recent projects include, and you'll probably see some of them in the lecture timely Anachronisms, but recent projects include the one I just mentioned, MIT Site 4 or SIT 4, which serves as an infinite corridor between the MIT campus and Kendall Square community, the Boston Public Library, the Street Branch, completed in 2021, and his work has also been internationally reviewed and published in many architecture magazines and books, and also magazines in Architect, the Architectural Record, Icon, Wallpaper, Monitor, The Plan, Abitare, Mark, Frame, ID, Contract, okay, and a few more. Recently, Nader contributed to something we feel very warm and fuzzy about, and that's Under Pressure, the conference organized by Hannah Jamel, sitting here also, essays on urban housing, and was basically edited by a senior lecturer of the urban housing. Oh, that was Hannah, sorry, which contextualizes recent conversations on urban housing through the design lens. And especially interesting, I think, was the conversation between people from the city, people such as architects, us, but also developers. So there was a quite lively and quite beautiful, I have to say, discussion on urban housing and the future of that. So really grateful that you collaborated with us on that, Nader. And with that, I'd like to invite you to give tonight's talk. Thank you.
Thank you for this kind introduction, as well as the invitation to be here. It is indeed wonderful to be in a physical place despite the masks. I will indeed be presenting some of the projects you mentioned, but the way I'm going to present tonight is in relationship to a set of themes that I'm trying to figure out for an eventual book. So the projects will be disaggregated into ideas, and I apologize in advance if it's not clear, but as critics, you can help me reconceptualize the book. Timely anachronisms refers to the only kind of thing that people of my age will get into. When you cannot any longer be in fashion and you cannot ever anymore be relevant to the moment, you start to imagine, why is it that we do what we do in architecture, and what is it that we aspire to? And my theory is that I would much rather produce a kind of work that is somewhat out of sync with the moment, with the hopes that it's speaking to an architect 200 years ago or 100 years from now, because there are certain things that establish a resonance with the discipline in a way that may not be seen immediately right now. The unmatched hair is a perfect and unfortunate example of this, because of global warming, should have actually been in a situation like this, but it brings out the cultural moment that we're living in through. So the themes that I'm talking about has to do with the monomaterial ethic, and the catalytic detail is something that we've been working on for many years. Those of you who know us know how we've spoken to that. Figurations and configurations, part-to-whole relationships. The tectonic grain, something that I developed in more recent years. Social engagement, and really it's an undeveloped category, but it maps out this tension between, if not our, but my compulsive need for control and the total loss of control when you're designing with the community. The pedagogical building, a present I received from Tom Cavan, the dean at Melbourne School of Design, about what happens when you design a school of architecture. It's no longer a space for the program. By de facto, it becomes an instrument, a didactic instrument. And so whether in goodness or in badness, everything that we are looking at here becomes a lesson in one way or another. And then political entanglements talks a little bit about the predicaments that I believe we all face and become the victims of in one way or another. So here we go in the different little chapters. The monomaterial ethic and the catalytic detail emerged from a fascination long time ago when we launched our office. And at that moment, materiality was not in the air. Let's say it was probably in the air in Switzerland, but not so much in the US. And my fascination with the idea that when you work with a certain material on the ground, on the wall, in the ceiling, in the roof, you're forcing it to do unnatural things that they don't want to do. So unlike Kahn asking you what the brick wants to be, I think what's more interesting is that the architect is forcing things onto substance that it doesn't want to do, and in doing so radicalizes the possibilities. The catalytic detail refers to something that Greg Lynn helped me understand in an exhibit actually called Intricacy right around the corner some years ago, which had to do with this idea that the detail is not the ultimate consummation of this delicate, precious moment, but rather is an element that is systemically developed in the beginning without any form in mind or without any ultimate configuration in mind. It becomes the mechanism through which you work. And I think that the work of Leverance is certainly demonstrative of that ability. Plečnik, another one of my favorites, in his library in Ljubljana has this amazing rustication of this wall that finds its way, it migrates up the elevation of that library and in a way naturalizes its heretic presence up in the air. So some of these projects you've seen, so I'm going to go right through them quite fast, but Casa La Roca is one of the early ones where we were looking at not the running bond nor the Flemish bond, but the idea that they have something in common. Their DNA is in the mortar line that is able to expand and contract. So it's the variable bond here that allows the kinetic movement, conceptual movement, not literal movements, of a bonding system that allows the passage of light and air through a conventional bonding system and gives it a structural stability, a lateral stability. The clients for this house eventually divorced, and so the project, the conceptual project, had to migrate to China. I have to thank Young Ho, where are you sitting now, for making this possible many, many years ago. In Tongxian, that used to be in the outskirts of Beijing, now probably completely surrounded by buildings, an arts complex for Jack Tilton, who passed away a couple of years ago, where this technique of the variable bond was eventually able to be produced. I was so paranoid about the craft of this, and I didn't realize that Chinese labor was able to produce this without any direction whatsoever from us. But in fact, the formwork for the concrete became the larger hurdle on the inside. It's important to note that while this is a brick building, it's more like a Roman method of construction. In other words, the brick is laid as the formwork, and then the concrete is poured in there, and then it's laid up a little bit more. And so you can see the crust of that concrete in certain moments and edges as it is articulated through the figuration of this building, and the venting and all of that gets embedded within this single material and the catalytic detail that makes it possible. Now, what happens when this is scaled up is completely different. In the world that we live in today with the kind of explorations with cross-laminated timber, this is, we all did something during COVID. This is the house I did for myself during COVID, where essentially we were trying to look at, the logic of CLT, which really has nothing to do with the incremental unit. The unit is ostensibly something that's 8 feet wide by 30, 40 feet long, and the beauty of it is in being able to cut into it minimally, like a stencil, to establish the structural viability of it, realizing also that it actually doesn't work very well for all of the other systems. So the reason this works is that the CLT has a kind of critical mass on the outside to give it the thermal mass it needs as a kind of insular barrier, but the stud wall on the interior is essentially what houses the plumbing, the electrical systems, the mechanical systems. And so strangely, it's the pairing of these two that makes this house work so well. With the elimination or the incorporation of the staircase that winds around the house, essentially the house is 4 floors, the same floor plan over and over again, with the bedroom basically rotating around 360 degrees, and using all of the space above and below the stair, the poché space as it were, to embed the closets, the showers, the toilets, and all of the other elements that go in such a small house. In doing so, the building then is really a tower that is composed of 2 types of spaces. The rooms itself, all of which have a little kitchenette and a closet, the bed, a bay window, and then all of them have the kind of the added bunk beds on the side, which have a view back onto the staircase on either side. So, figurations and configurations. Some of you may have seen this in prior years, but the argument is basically that the nest and the bowl are basically the same thing. The molecular composition of material in the bowl is not evident to the eye, and yet there are aggregates in there. But what is beautiful about the nest is that the twigs and the grass and the blades of natural elements are part of its expression. But they also demonstrate how working configuratively, you're not bound to the figure of the nest, that it can morph into many other things. And so a lot of the research that we've done is on the right side of the page. If you like, the bowl is what we inherit culturally, typologically, iconically. What's on the right is the possibility of becoming, or architecture as an act of becoming. This is all also kind of has a latent connection to questions of symbolism and semiotics. I've always liked the little argument in The Little Prince where the figure of the hat also has a rapport with a deep reading of what's behind the skin, essentially that architecture somehow has an ethical commitment to what lies behind it. And I think that all of you have somehow engaged in the problem of representation, whether literal or in some way problematically placed in the cloaking of buildings. How do you represent contested geometries and organizations, knowing fully well that a lot of architectures are trying to do something on the outside that they cannot do on the inside, or vice versa. And so this problem of configurations and figurations is something that we're constantly dealing with. In the context of RISD, which is a large master plan, the entire project comes together in a new building called North Hall here that is composed of 2 walls on the east-west and another 2 walls on the north-south. The 2 walls on the east-west are essentially composed of a borrowing from the context, essentially taking the shingles off of the roofs of all of the neighboring houses and essentially cloaking it onto the elevation at a completely defamiliarized scale. The scale of that shingle now becomes the full height, almost the full height of a floor. And the argument that I'm making here is a very simple one. Essentially, the idea that the shingle wall establishes a rapport with the fenestration itself, and that the action of shingling and the operability of the window are doing the same thing. And so the catalytic detail comes into work in that moment where the shingling and the window are essentially opening and closing together. And the building then becomes, in a way, a deployment of these systems. And as you all know, as these things get programmed, they change all the time. That what was the program in schematic design, in design development, and CDs, it was completely changed. And so the composition of those windows is merely an index of a moment in time when something had to be committed to. working not with shingles, but with rebar, we had an opportunity in collaboration with John Wardle to build the bridge that would have connected Djokovic to his court had he taken his vaccine. This is the pedestrian bridge that connects the Yarra River, the great park. Donald Bates's great project is right down there on axis. And the bridge, for us, was an opportunity to speculate on what could be done with a structural system if used in a redundant format to overcome the traditional dichotomy between structure and skin. I say this all very self-consciously because we failed, but I'm determined, at least in the academic context, to allow you to do it for me on the next round. But essentially, the figure of the bridge or the figure of the roof, the pediment, is really the embodiment of the maximum moment. Ultimately, that's what you're seeing here. In our fantasy, the idea was that the weaving of these rebars and their redundancy could give figure to the overall depth of that volume that spans to allow essentially a rebar system to wrap underneath the belly, over the railing, and eventually become the lighting that is in dialogue with the skyline behind. But the element, essentially, the configuration and redundancy of the rebars weaving together allows for the figure of the maximum moment to get embodied in that horizon line between the landscape, which is where you really inhabit. Remember, this view here, that is occupied only 2 weeks of the year. This is the very weeks that we're talking about. This is when the rest of the year, that's what it looks like. Nobody goes there. So essentially the view of this bridge is always about the reflected ceiling plan of the underbelly, another theme that I'll speak to in a bit. In the context of the Daniels building, and here I'll speak only about its side elevations, we were dealing with another shingle system. Here, 2 blank elevations on the east and west, because the entire window to this building was on the northern facade, a kind of ambient light into the studio space. And really the shingling of the side allowing for the porosity of a double skin where the east-west axis, which is the main front door of the building, is allowed to cross all the way through from the University of Toronto all the way to the neighborhoods on the opposite side. Figures and figuration, embody themselves in 2 fundamentally different ways, if not more. The figure on the left side is sculpted with an indifference to the bonding system of the brick. And whatever figures emerge out of the bonding system on the right are beholden to the logic of bonding. And so in many ways our work is beholden to the right side, allowing us to escape from the literalism, if you like, of certain representations in lieu of a commitment to understanding how geometry and matter work together. In this case, the idea that corrugation is rigid on one axis, but malleable on the other, allows us to develop a logic for a curtain wall that has the same length at the top than the bottom, which allows precisely for its figural possibilities. You can unwind this. This happens to be an awning between the living room and the garden, but it's an awning that emerges from the skin rather than a canopy that's added onto the building as such. But it's also a demonstration. It's an illustration that in architecture we do not illustrate, we construct drawings. Other demonstrations of part-to-whole relationships, I think everybody in this room at some point has tessellated at one moment or another in the context of the Goldman Sachs project in downtown New York. It's not a project you can photograph very well, but this is not a smooth project. This is in fact panelized, and the project was really about how to make 85% of the panels generic, so that only the last 10-15% are the ones that have compound curvatures as part of them. And then we understood also what are the other finishes that can go on this. So despite the uniformity of the photograph, there are subtle ranges of reflectivity and mattness that go to these panels. So this is much more of an ashlar project than the eye is allowed to perceive right now. One of the most embarrassing projects we've ever done is the bank project. This is hands down the most copied project in the world. It is wonderful to know that you've done something bad enough to be copied, but this is another one of those projects that is wholly invested in the reflected ceiling plan. I say this because in this case, obviously the reflected ceiling plan emerges out of an interesting and imperative, that is the flexibility of the ground of a restaurant needs to be able to reform constantly on a daily basis. So the mechanical systems, the lighting, the wine room and the structure all get beholden to a logic from the ceiling coming down to give the important presence of this sort of iconic canopy above. All of this to get you to the Adams Library, a situation in which the sixth facade, the reflected ceiling plan, is an exposed structure, the exposed acoustic baffles, and all of the mechanical systems, all exposed in a public project that is ostensibly quite economical in its parts. The logic of the Adams Library is that it's in a neighborhood in Dorchester. It is mandated to all be on a single floor. And essentially, by virtue of the way they wanted, by the way, this is one of the ones where we had to work with the community. I'll talk about that later. But as a mat building on one floor, it's essentially a building that had to do two things. One, establish a civic presence on the main street. In our minds, extending a more informal promenade in the back alley at the scale of the houses in the back, connecting them with what I call the fifth elevation, a roof that is performing the duties of hydrology, bringing all of the water to the back, excavating a court in the south, and framing an existing oak tree to the north. These two gardens become essential elements, outdoor reading rooms for the library. The logic of the three rooms has to do with the adults, the adolescents, and the kids, while the beams are single beams that go the width of the building all the way through east-west. So the kind of the logic of light is north-south, but the structure goes east-west, and you're inhabiting these two grains in a kind of ice cream sandwich that you inhabit between, and there's the main outdoor reading room, which is the oak tree in the north. So I won't speak too much about the skin. I think you can intuit some of that, but we can speak about it later if you're interested. But the building, the front, and the diminutive scale of the back, each of the pitches correspond to either an office or a smaller reading space in the back, and the two are essentially ruled together. Essentially the reflected ceiling plan becoming the main instrument that connects it all. On the one side, the interior looking back out at the main stream with a storefront, with a raked roof going all the way up to the center pitch, which is actually bent in plan. So it has other anomalies that are part of this. And then the back face, which is the vessel that holds all of the different programs in the back, broken down to parts. This device of figuration comes into play for the Villa Varoise, which is essentially a landscape project. It's a house, but essentially a landscape project that divides the public and the private level of the house into two levels. The bedrooms, the guest bedrooms and the kids' bedrooms are on the lower floor in red, and in green on the upper floor, the living room and the master wing, which basically are an L configuration such that you can take off your clothes in the courtyard and not be seen by any of the neighbors. And so it's a monolith that comes together in the corners by way of two stairs that perform structurally for the purposes of this, to enable the continuity of this landscape. So you're looking now at the front facade, which is a beam that is cantilevered all the way out. And on the left side, you see the rake of the stair, which is not only a circulatory mechanism, but it is the structure that holds up the beam of the front facade, what you're looking at in this diagram, and essentially makes the donut continuous. So the logic of this building as a type, if you like, is that it's malleable. It is able in plan to conform to the distortions of the site, the views towards the Mediterranean on one side and the Pinus Pinei on the other. The idea that an internal looking court by way of the deformation of topography is able to step down, creating views for both the lower and the upper level. The opening up on the roof, making the west views of the Pinus Pinei as powerful as the views towards the Mediterranean, and ultimately the continuity of that landscape coming up into the court and beyond to the northern part of the site. The western part of the site is a central part of the landscape plan of this building as it goes into construction. Naturally, the grain of the concrete becomes a major part of the rhetoric of this building, and I'll show you something about that a little bit later, because that's a hugely contested territory. What the building does allow, of course, is the idea that it has a certain grace of transparency and porosity in those areas that it remains private. As a type, it's essentially like a case study house. I mean, it's just a glass box on one side, but it's important to put this in the context of structural explorations we've done. The building is not only spanning laterally, the short length, but the long length. Think Kimball here for a second, because the vaults that open up to the Pinus Pinei are actually ruled surfaces that go along the long axis of the living room and distort against a flat plane on the opposite side, opening up essentially to the views of the trees on the west and the uphill extension that you see in this diagram, while on the opposite side they flatten out and then open out onto a kind of more horizontal and serene view towards the Mediterranean. The tectonic grain refers to not only the natural, but the fabricated grains that you and I invariably inherit, whether we're working with brick or with wood or with something. There are material assemblies. Look at the carpet that we're standing on right now. They have a kind of cross grain to them. Note also that in Devil's Tower, while from a distance we see the surge going vertically at a more intimate scale, you see that there's a horizontal grain to that. A lot of the work of the catalytic detail looks at the tectonic grain as part of its conception of the kinds of things that we've been doing. Think for a second about the ways that we saw wood, the way, the quarter-sawn cut gives you the kind of continuity and the iteration of striations that makes for a much more delicate veneer. So a lot of our work really revolves around the actuality of construction, but also the perception of construction. And the way that perception and actuality go together are very much tethered to an idea about the syntax of architecture. In the New England house, for instance, we take the board and batten system as a typical vernacular, but we also use it as a way of muting the conventional attributes that you would otherwise have to buy from Home Depot, so that the garage is now silenced by the continuity of that skin, even down to the door handle, which is a kind of unraveling of the batten system. In the context of Villa-Varroise, we found ourselves for the first time with a tectonic that is not additive, but in a way either subtractive or liquid, as it were. Concrete, at the end, is liquid. So it's either the formwork that is giving its expression, or it's post-production work as you bush hammer it. And so I think we're all familiar with sort of amazing historic works and some contemporary works with fabric forming. And so we were testing out two different techniques of how to eventually deploy the concrete in France. The first was representational, and the other one was ingrained in the substance of the aggregate. The representational one imagined that we would work with digital formwork, essentially, that we would exact by way of a smooth surface that eventually becomes rusticated as it goes inside into the house. Drawing out of this excavation a kind of grotesque interior that would ultimately be very expensive for a house that is already expensive. The other example you've also seen done very beautifully by Wright is the idea that you challenge the scale of the aggregate, knowing fully well that a concrete wall is already filled with aggregate, but how to exact that aggregate and how to manipulate it. In the context of this house, we imagined, what if we do the inverse, that it's a smooth interior that is cast in panels that incrementally shift the scale of that aggregate to larger scales until it just inverts the figure ground, such that the concrete becomes the mortar that holds a very conventional stone wall in the French landscape together on the outside. Needless to say, these are our fantasies that either require very wealthy clients or a different world within which to operate. But with a lot of sandblasting, you can draw out of the concrete and its formwork the grain of the wood, which becomes a substitute for something that appears rather mute and monolithic from a distance, but becomes quite animate in the sunlight. What happens is also that the earth, the clay, in southern France is quite amber and almost red, and so it really shines the light quite beautifully. We have been working with wood a lot more recently, and for the recent installation for the Biennale, we had the opportunity to work with cross-laminated timber again. And in this case, we did something completely different. Working with a certain devices of patterning, we realized that, well, what is cross-laminated timber? It is a series of studs that are essentially overlaid on top of each other and glued in such a fashion that you never actually witness the tectonic grain until you start to route it out. And so the herringbone pattern that you're seeing right now is drawn out of a routing structure whereby the depth of the structure is on the diagonal. The column locations are at the two corners. The way that the canopy is then intersected by other pieces of the canopy get locked into those corners, and the columns are then placed into those sections. This is a project much like some of the other ones that we've attempted to eradicate the conventional differences between structure and skin, where the ornament is drawn out of the depth of the structure itself. So we go back then to RISD to see the north and south elevation, again, extending the logic, which is such an impending pressure on all of the work in New England to work with the context aggressively and find ways of extending the logic of the existing brick into these new buildings. And in our case, it establishes the logic of the sokol, the foundation, and the north and south, much as it is in dialogue with the original buildings from the 1950s. And knowing that we're working essentially with a veneer wall, like a curtain wall situation of brick, that you don't have much depth to produce the illusion of solidity and mass. So all of this is about half an inch out, half an inch in, and the best that you can do is to work with light in such a way that it produces the illusion of solidity and mass. In this case, so much so that it also produces a kind of monolithic figure of RISD itself, the sort of the large Neolithic inscriptions RISD in the loggia that frames the division between the drop-off area and Nickerson Green on the opposite side, but also eventually what articulates the south face, which is a series of panels that are essentially self-similar, but they're doing different variations of the same game. Essentially a stacked bond system that is either being pushed out, pushed in, or flushed out with windows that are carved in either 3 inches, 6 inches, or 9 inches, producing the illusion of depth where there is none. In contrast to that, of course, there's the thinness of the shingles that you've already seen. And so how to bring these two logics together on an edge condition that underscores the artifice of all of these operations. The thinness of that blade is very much at stake here in the turning of these corners, and how you do not naturalize the shingles, but rather you heighten them even further by the way that they differentiate themselves, not only from the north and the west, but also the neighboring buildings. This obsession with thinness is something that extends to other buildings also, because it's almost an ethic that is about how does one detail a curtain wall. And I think the MIT project is exemplary of that. A building whose logic, we did hundreds of studies of this, but eventually realized that the best possible siting of this is to run the building north-south so that the Marriott Hotel would finally get its own view of the river. But that means that the majority of our building has either east or west elevations, and so it needs to work differently with the facade. The grain of that building really has to do with a logic of a building that is cantilevered over two existing buildings and produces an optical illusion because of the staggering of what is the garden wall effect, an optical illusion that is the result of the geometric offset. And the building bulges in the center so that all of the services are in its core, the cladding of the outside of which really works with an incredibly conventional anodized aluminum system that we introduced 2 or 3 other variations of colors in the intermediate to produce the illusion of height in a building that is ultimately not so tall. The logic of the plan, as I said, is about thinning out the ends, much like RISD, by radicalizing the blades, but then absorbing some of the mechanical systems and the services in the center, as well as the circulation, all of the bathrooms and kitchens on the kind of saddlebags. And the one bonus you get is that you do occupy the windows that look north and south. And then the skin has, approximately, 9 inches with which to play. And the folding of that anodized aluminum produces a specular quality that is just amazing in the sunrise and the sunset. There are moments that this building is absolutely serious and dark, and then there are moments when it's incredibly golden to the point of hysteria. And so it has a quality that I suppose I would want to say we anticipated, but could never have imagined in the way that these photographs are trying to show. The end grain of these buildings, much like the RISD one, are different ruminations about how the scaling of those end grains are exercised over the range of the building. I think some of you have seen these slides, but this is where I make the argument about the tectonic grain, is that when we look at the zebra in a photograph, we naturalize it and realize that these are devices that nature brings to find a way to make the animals survive in the kind of the savanna. It's only when I turn the slide that you realize that that grain was totally artificial. We all know that the stripes of a zebra go perpendicular not only to the torso but also the legs. And so there's a lot of architecture that goes into the turning of the corners, actually, not the actual striping. And but this is what alerts you to what it is that you and I actually do. We are in the business of artifice and the construction of grain. This is where it gets a little bit messy, but also messy in a good way. And I haven't found a way to be more generous to this chapter, but it is an important one, particularly because it's happening both. I mean, we have an office that, is 20 people. At any given moment, we're doing a master plan urban design, a big institutional building, a house, an interior, a piece of furniture, and an installation. So we're not experts in anything, but sometimes we still accept all of the kinds of things that are exhibit-oriented. In this case, we were able to collaborate with villagers in Jordan on an installation for Amman Design Week. And really it had to do with our ability to not only control something, but actually give away some of that control to people who know better what they're doing and find our authorship through other people. The other side of these kinds of collaborations have to do with a much, much more complex negotiation and mediation with cultural forces at large. The justice system, the social justice system that is now being challenged at Rikers Island to decentralize justice and to be able to get the community, families, those incarcerated, and police officers, everybody to be involved at the community level cannot no justice can be done on Rikers Island. So there's an effort in New York right now to be able to bring that down to the community level. We had a lot to do with the Van Allen study that imagined how would you bring the people together to have that dialogue. There's no design here. It is really about a conversation about collaboration. Other collaborations involve collaborations with artists, in this case with Adam Silverman and some of the work that we did in California together. Him being an expert, an experimental potter of some sort, developing out of found materials in Nevada in the desert, based on all of the missile testing grounds that they've taken, these kind of bullet-like shapes. Our contribution to his work was really how those elements were truncated at different dimensions so that they could find themselves in very different installations in the 3 or 4 different museums and galleries that they ended up with. So the configuration that you're seeing here is just one of many configurations that it eventually saw. It's now a permanent, it found its permanent home at the Nasher in Texas. But it gives you a kind of sense about where his skills and our imagination would be able to come together to produce this landscape of pottery. In the context of Amman, it really had to do with a collaboration with local craftsmen, a fashion designer, ourselves, bringing together a mode of fabrication that would eventually essentially become the blankets for refugees. So it's this elaborate exhibit in this, grand hall designed eventually by Sahel Al-Hiyari in order to produce this suspended structural system for 1 week. That is the basis for ultimately an engagement with the refugee camps which were around the corner. But what is it that we do when we get into institutional work and this collaborative process? There is no project that we've done that doesn't have 13 focus groups or neighborhood mediations. The project we did in MIT, we went into client presentations which were larger than this audience here. So at what level are you allowed to bring any integrity to a project that is designed by 60 people altogether? And certainly the Daniels faculty was one of those projects where the new site that we inherited was around Spadina Circle with the Knox College as an existing building to be revitalized as part of this effort. And with lots of great spaces for offices and seminar rooms, but with the large studio hall to its north, almost as a landscape element, with all of its additions embedded in the ground, with the idea that this foundation would always preserve the view of the tower, which is the real marker looking north and south of this great site. And remember, the Daniels faculty is for landscape and urbanism, so this is a project that is not trying to be designed for architects. It is about its relationship to the city in the broader realm. Also important to understand that this is a project that symbolically operates on the north-south axis, but practically on the east-west. It is the road that cuts through it, the pedestrian road that cuts through it, that is its practical front door. And so the internal street that we cut through it is where all of the public program is, the main auditorium, a peek up into the studio spaces, the Fab Lab. This is where the heart, the soul, the cafe, everything happens in this building, and it's the one place that's open 24/7. So much like this building, everything else is carded, but this is always open. And importantly, it reconnects at the core of the building where it's the darkest. It reconnects back up to Spadina North through a double height Fab Lab, which then opens up to the outside and makes that spatial connection actual as the construction space of the digital lab moves outside and becomes the facade itself. So for a building that is very much object-like, at the end it's just a crate. It's the cheapest way that you can make a studio space. It is very much also a landscape building in the way that at each level there are critical extensions that come in, penetrate the building and ooze out of the building at all levels, including the studio space, which is the space aloft. Now, if that building is really an embodiment of a collaboration with architects, urbanists, fabricators, landscape architects. When you're designing with the city, I take you back here to Adams Library, it is one of the most excruciatingly difficult things I've ever had to do in my life. Because for 1 year, you're not allowed to draw. You're only allowed to diagram with the community. And by the time it's over, it's a plan that you do not recognize as being something that you were able to control. So I'll tell you what I controlled, and I'll tell you how this came about. Essentially, the mechanism of security and control is paramount in a library. So it's a panoptic structure, end of story. So the central control station, which happens at the center, knows who's coming in and who's going out, and knows who's checking. And the checking out of books is the least of all of this. It really has to do with the surveillance of homeless people. It has to do with the surveillance of people looking at pornography and making sure that each of the age groups are safe in their own 3 spaces. So the separation of adults, adolescents, and kids is paramount to this exercise. So essentially it's a structure with a head and 3 tentacles, if not 4, which are the wings that define the differences between these different social groups that come together, and how to give that clarity as a diagram, and how to give it an architectural tectonic that is able to become legible was really part of our task. And it produces moments of legibility, like I say this of the kind of frontality and the pedimentrid singularity of the pediment in the front, and how that essentially rolls around the side to become an anamorphic condition as it extends around the oak tree to the north. And that view is a central part, of course, because it's not only connected to the teen area, but it's also connected to the common hall where the auditorium and public rooms are. These kinds of things really extend into some of the Biennale work that we've done, where it's just senseless to build these things that are then demolished after 2 months. So, our logic in collaborating with the Shenzhen Biennale was, why is it that we are not building a public space that has some perpetuity to it? And they said, well, this is a great idea, and why don't we already have the plaza, and we have a garage space, but that garage can become the cafe for which you're going to design an awning. And so, in the purest sense, I won't speak to the architecture of this or the ideas. In a way, it doesn't matter at a certain level. It matters, in this case, the process of appropriation, which completely transforms the reading of what we had intended. And I think that, in some sense, that's a moment of humility to any of these projects. That is that moment of absorption into a different logic. There are other public projects which are incredibly difficult. The idea of discovering a center of town, which is essentially an electrical power station with, the main mall, the library, and all of the main civic institutions, and you're asked to design the edge condition of that center. The center is the power station, and you're designing the donut around it, and so the kind of the minutia of negotiations with all of the stakeholders around the edge, while using precast concrete and coloring to establish associations with this or that group as a common red thread that goes around it. Again, as I said, I don't have this well tethered together, but there's something in this discussion which I think is important about sometimes how we design things with specifications, and other times how we design frameworks which are infinitely tolerant of people's contamination, and how do you survive that process. I take you now to the end chapter of political entanglements, and where we started with this was really with the realization that architects are hired for design intent, and apparently not for the means and methods. And so that is the ultimate castration of the architect's will to establish reciprocity between idea and objecthood. And so a lot of our battle has gone into absorbing political territory that is not rightfully ours, at least in this legal system in the US. Very different in other places. But an idea about the public realm is very much at stake within this context, and I'll try to give a couple of narratives to describe that. In the context of Melbourne Uni, the MSD finds itself in a central location which has no back. There are only 4 fronts to this building. And essentially, we find ourselves in a beautiful campus of neo-Georgian courtyards with another matte building, deep and wide. The only way to get light into it is to create yet another court that eventually, which was meant to act as a kind of lobby space that brought everybody together, but the end of the story is that it became the studio space. Why is that? Well, simply put, value engineering. But imagine that the entire purpose of the MSD was to compete with RMIT, which has dedicated studio space. In the US, we are one of the only countries that has dedicated studio space. The idea for Melbourne Uni, much like Toronto, was to establish a studio space that looks out onto the city and then has all of the different discipline groups stacked on top of each other, ascending to the studio space. It turns out that within the first 2 months, they realized they didn't have the budget for it. And so our task became, how do you develop a vestige of that commitment to studio space on the vertical axis rather than the horizontal? So extracting out of the net to gross area a dimension of corridor that they didn't have, taking the corridor from 7 feet to 15 feet, and then robbing the programs behind them on time schedules where classes were not being held. So that studio space gets amplified by that much. Now, all of this is while knowing that if you have different programs of studio on the edge and different discipline groups, that the landscape group is going to come down for this, and the architectural group is going to go up for that, and some kind of cross-pollination is apt to happen on these terraces that ultimately see the life of the building on this fringe that has a kind of spatial depth based on how you use them. So exhibit crit space at the bottom with the social space in the center, collective desks on the second floor with studio space, drafting boards on the third floor with research hubs for the master's program on the third and fourth floor, crit spaces with the PhD programs. All of this brought together through the eradication of the railing and then adopting the FF&E budget as a vehicle to make that railing with a kind of extend mesh. So the collaborative tables, the model making tables on one level, the drafting at another, the crit spaces at another, and then all of it sort of brought together into one learning space. In the context of the Daniels faculty, which I presented earlier, the whole debate revolved around one moment where I was getting on a plane to go to Australia, and they told me, the roof is out. We can't afford this roof. I said, why not? They said, it's unbuildable. I said, but it is buildable. It's, we designed it, and it's a ruled surface, and, you can make the formwork for it. They say, no, it is not buildable. So we built a model and we sent it to them, and they said, that's a model, that's not architecture. So, we gave them examples of how this is done. They didn't accept it. But ultimately, it came down to a moment in which, if we were going to keep that intact, a structural system that is in dialogue with the daylighting system and the hydrological control of the water to the edge, we had to transform what is a concrete building into a stick building. And so we built the mock-up in our own studio. We have a fab lab in our own basement where we built it all out of stick. And then we discovered that there are gypboard panels that are radiant panels. And so imagining that the heat is coming from the concrete below, but the cooling system is coming from the radiant panel above you. And it was priced out and came down $800,000, resulting in the immediate deployment of that roof, I would say almost as it was imagined, slightly thicker as a crust, but nonetheless a low-resolution version of that, which is then covered by the radiant panels and eventually painted white to erase the seams of the aggregates that are obviously the chipboard panels. Now, this is important, of course, not only because it's a studio space, but because it is also, much like this space, an extension of, the studio space looks into the main lecture hall, and that connection north to Spadina North is still an important part of the way that these predicaments are overcome. The pedagogical building, of course, has a lot to do with this. At what moment is it that a building just supports itself, and at what point does it become exemplary? And so there are moments like in the Georgia Tech project where we inherited essentially a beautiful 20th century piece of architecture, a composite of brick, glass, concrete. And we realized that the ultimate necessity of this space was about the flexibility of the ground. And what would it mean if we relieved the ground of any program? And the only way to do that was to turn the building upside down and say that the truss of the roof is its foundation and everything is suspended from above, and refashion the gantry crane as a mechanism to suspend a new studio space. And so conceptually, it's a project that has flexible furniture on the ground that are then excavated for the Beaux-Arts ball, graduation, et cetera, et cetera. The studio is then suspended from the roof. The fire stair is suspended from the roof. The lights are suspended from the roof. And the building is essentially a building in suspense. This is a cheaper project than the other ones, much more economical, so much so that we couldn't even afford to polish the research of the sign. So we only polished the ARCH as it transformed from an engineering building to an architecture building. The idea of that suspended studio obviously is central to the Melbourne School of Design. They wanted, out of all of the hot desks, one dedicated studio space for the visiting critics, and so we very much wanted to develop a logic, and I've sort of spoken to the monomateriality aspect of our thesis from the very beginning, in contrast to the precedents that you and I are so familiar with. The Tempietto with its many historic layers of fabric around it, the object and the fabric, the British Arts, where the banal fire stair acquires a kind of totemic presence in that space, semi-ingrained in the structural logic of the building, and in what is possibly Gary's best building, the kind of neutrality of the frame in relationship to the figuration of the center. Now, all of these, as different as they are, resort to that dichotomy that we were trying to overcome. In the context of that dichotomy, we wanted to develop a roof that has a structural logic, a span of 22 meters with a depth of 3-4 meters of LVLs, quite deep, with coffering that ends up being distorted to allow light in there, but not direct sunlight. And then invert the tectonics such that the suspended studio does not touch the ground, but is embedded within it a kind of monolithic structure that nestles the structure. Massive pieces of lumber that hold the studio spaces as this proposition within the space. Again, not really the kind of thing you can photograph, because suspense, levity is not something, it's something you have to experience, it's not something you can photograph. But there is something awesome about the massiveness of the coffering translating onto the skin, and the thinness of the fringe at the bottom of that thinness. So what we're talking about here is the inversion of the classical system of rustication as it thins out on the top, here with the massive timber at the top with the veneers of plywood at the bottom. Here the incrustation of the coffering translating itself into the studios of the top space, in contrast to the thinness of the acoustic panels at the very bottom. This is an interesting project also, by the way, because it was slated for 24 months of construction. Ultimately, the majority of it was done off-site, prefabricated and brought to the site in early moments of the morning and done in 18 months. So they did very well and we did very well as a consequence. So successful is this project at a kind of social level that apparently architects can't use it anymore because the entire campus uses it as their space. And this is one of those popular moments where we get to feel good as architects when we do something that is successful for reasons which have nothing to do with anything I've said tonight. Thank you very much. I know I've spoken a lot, but if there are any questions, I don't know what the conventions are here, I'm happy to receive it.
Oh, I guess I need a microphone. And just curious about the similarities or differences in the institutions that you were dealing with and how that affected or didn't affect the work.
Look, I think culture matters. I would say there are a lot more similarities between the United States, Canada, and Australia than the projects we've done tentatively in Iran, in Chile, or in France. But understanding culture and process has been a central part of both our successes and failures. I think that what the Daniels and Melbourne had in common, first of all, they came a little bit later after a lot of our failures, but they came with an understanding of a commitment to collaborative ethic, knowing that when you're designing a school of architecture, at a minimum, you have about 500 to 2,000 audience members who are doing exactly what you're doing, either better than what you're doing or on par with it at least. So you're not teaching them anything. You are, if anything, you're embodying their aspirations in some kind of mediated space. I think it's different in the sense that, they're not all architecture schools are the same, but they're all filled with literate people, and it's very difficult to do that if you're not attendant to that form of intelligence. I think that the Adams Library was far more difficult. It's difficult to say this in a public forum, but there are elements that will never be articulated outside of this space. Latent racism was always there. Being in a neighborhood in Dorchester was not easy. And then also finding ways in which to connect to different groups in a bureaucratic system that is incredibly complex and political outside of the academic realm is very different. So the politics are played out in a very different way in the Boston public library systems and the local library systems, which are not one and the same. And so there were many tensions between the Boston public library system, which has design as an aspiration, versus the local library system, which sees this as my neighborhood, my territory, and what are you doing here? And the local librarian who is then kept out of that same process. So at these three levels, there are so many tensions that nobody told us about, but we discovered along the way, realizing that we are probably the most insignificant of any of those players. So I think that there's an incredible learning curve that comes with understanding culture and not only what can you get away with, but how can you make an intelligent response to a cultural situation. I can't begin to tell you, for a person that doesn't really drink much alcohol, how much I've drank in Korea in order to do the kinds of things I tried to do there. So it resonates at many other levels about how practice is undertaken and what the conventions are in different societies and all of that. But I have to say that, with all of the things that we did in, let's say, Canada and Australia, what I think is more interesting is when you're working in lesser developed countries where products and specifications are not necessarily the cheapest way to go, that there are levels of customization that end up being much more affordable. So within the political territory that you're describing, a lot of our work has gone into sort of the means and methods of how some things are built, where you can tap into certain local trades that can do something far more exciting from the conceptual point of view of what you're working on, rather than relying on the guaranteed products of a certain specification, which effectively dulls all differences. But I think, the ultimate message is one of humility, that once you're entering into a situation where there isn't a client with the omnipotent power, and you're dealing with communities and stakeholders which hold different views, so much of this has to do with your ability to find common denominators, spaces of mediation, and your ability to produce consensus in a genuine way, knowing that certain things have to be eradicated along the way. So, and I do think that, it's not visible to the eye, but both in Daniels and in Melbourne, there's a lot that was aspirational that never happened because they realized that here are the things that we hold in common, and we're going to fight for those rather than ask for everything we originally asked for. And there's nothing better than you could get in a project than getting the clients to feel that they're the ones who designed the building, and therefore they're the ones fighting for ultimately what you end up designing. Thank you for having me.